Tonight I will talk to you about Aucher-Éloy, who was the first plant collector in this part of the world. And his collections were some of the first ones that were made and many of the plant species or the plants that he collected were new to science. He took a journey into Oman, and that journey took him about a month in the northern part of Oman during the time 1838. So it's quite a long time ago, and he obviously met with a lot of difficulties traveling into this country. Of course, now if you know Oman, there are roads, there are four-wheel drives, so you can get to most parts by road. You don't really have to walk. But being a plant collector, being a botanist, he preferred to walk because he always said that if you are on a donkey or a camel, you are going to miss the flora, you're going to miss some of the important species. So he always went on foot, and many times complained that the stones were so sharp that his feet bled. I was very fortunate to be in Oman for a fair number of years. I was teaching at Sultan Qaboos University, and during that time, my research and studies on the Flora of Oman led me to do this trip because I was on the hunt for the plant specimens as well, walking in many of the areas where Aucher had been. And I thought what would be quite a nice thing to do is to retrace his journey. Obviously, by that time, we did have four-wheel drive, so much of the journey was done on a four-wheel drive, and in several times of the year, but I tried to stick to March and April, which are the spring months after the winter rains, when many of the flowers begin to flower. I did find quite a number of the plants as he had recorded them during this time. There were some which were no longer there. So I'll take you through this journey today on some of the difficulties, some of the nice memoirs that he maintained during his journey, and share that with you. So this is Aucher-Éloy, a nice young French plant collector who was born a very long time ago in 1793, studying under fairly renowned botanists of that time, Jussieu and Desfontaines. He was a little bit, depressed. He didn't really want to stay on in Paris. He wanted to get out and have a little bit more of an adventurous life. So he came to Turkey to start a newspaper. Was not really happy about that either, and then decided that he would try to make collections and travel to these different parts of the Orient, something new, so that he would be able to sell these collections back to Paris and elsewhere, and make some of his money in that way. So during the 38 years, from 1830 to 1838, he traveled to most of the countries, mostly in Oman, in Iran, in Egypt. Unfortunately, the one that he came to Oman in 1838 was to be his last, after which he was too ill to continue on anywhere and passed away. While he was in the interior of the Imamate of Muscat at that time, as it was called, his condition deteriorated, and he was forced to return back to Isfahan, which is in Iran, and passed away, and he is buried in Juniper. Now, I haven't had the chance to go to Juniper to see where he's buried, but apparently he is buried at St. Mary's Church near Isfahan. When he was in Oman, he was not really able to collect as many species or as much plant wealth as he had hoped. Well, Oman is a very dry country. It doesn't have a very diverse flora and fauna. And he wrote in his memoirs, he says, how then could a poor botanist fare who is obliged to combine science and trade in his botany? He would be reluctantly given 30 francs per 100 specimens and would be thought of well rewarded. He was paid 40 francs per 100 specimens from Geneva, where his top set, or not his top set, but his second top set remains. And I've had the opportunity to visit both France, in Paris at the Natural History Museum, and to Geneva, where his collections are placed basically to identify the plants correctly to their current names, and to be able to, well, to kind of celebrate his collections in a way. Now, when he passed away, in the London Journal of Botany, his kind of obituary or his life was sketched. And I don't want to go through the whole thing. And it says, all the friends of natural science, we feel pleasure in becoming acquainted with the career of one of the most daring investigators whom that science has ever inspired. So he was quite well, I mean, although he was not extremely well known while he was collecting plants, but after he had passed away and the people who looked at his collections realized the importance of his collections, they were quite pleased. And it says also that such individuals compose a society amongst themselves, and they're talking about collectors, not necessarily of plants, but those who take very daring journeys into unknown territories to collect animals or plants or other information. It has its own existence, its own peculiar language, and its running science, and one consolidated in the efforts to perform a common object, to promote a common object. So his journey was basically quite short. I mean, when you look at it now, but it took him almost a month to do it. As I said earlier, he traveled on foot and on donkey. Traveled, for those of you who know Oman a little bit, Muscat is the capital, and Matra used to be the main city at that time, where many of the boats would come in. So he traveled from Matra and Muscat to Sib, which is again a coastal town, went to Barka, which is, well, literally about 10 miles now, came to Nahal, which is a fair journey, came to Wakkan, which was perhaps the hardest of his journeys. It is through the mountains, through a pass. Up from Wakkan to Saik, which is a very difficult climb. Even today, there isn't actually a road which takes you from Wakkan to Saik, from the side of the mountains, which he ascended. There are steps which you can go on, but they are pretty treacherous. From Saik, which is a plateau, he came to Wadi Bani Habib. From there, descended down to Tanoof, to Nizwa, to Birkat al-Maus, Iski, and then back through Samail, which is a gap between the two set of mountains, and then back to Matra. So many of the plants that he collected on his journey were new to science, and they were described for the first time by Boissier in Flora Orientalis. And Flora Orientalis to this day remains the main reference book for anybody working in the Orient. These are the original descriptions that he gives of many of the species that are described, or they were collected by Aucher. So many of the plants, as they're named, if you are familiar with botany, it has a generic name and it has a specific name. The specific name for many of the plants that were collected by Aucher bore Muscatense, which was its geographical origin, Aucheriana or Auchery, which honored the collector. Some of them were called Arabica as well, but most of the plants from Oman bore that name. So we have the photographs of Polygamous muscatense. This is quite common, found more or less throughout the foothills of the northern mountains. There is Resida aucheri, which is an annual. Caralluma, or the noun is now changed to Desmidocus, but it's Caralluma aucheriana, quite a beautiful succulent Euphorbiaceae, quite unique to this area and quite a smelly plant when it starts to flower, pollinated by what are these flies called, which are attracted to dung. It smells like dung. Those type of flies. So it's pollinated by those flies. And a very pretty Lonicera, which is a very, it also is quite fragrant, again named out of Aucher. These were all new to science and were described for the first time in Boissier's book. So all the time that Aucher was collecting, he maintained his field notebook, which was this one. And you can see over here, it says Muscat, March, and April. And most plant collectors will do that. They have a notebook in which they record the specimens as they collect in the field and give a number. So I looked at his numbers, which is, say, for example, for capsicum, it is 1016, went to his original collections and saw that number on the plant specimen itself. And that is how you can relate or you can validate what he collected was true or not. And surely many of the plants are correctly numbered. In Boissier's Flora Orientalis, the numbers that are given are by the accession numbers. So his numbers are not the same as the ones which are given on Aucher's journal or in his field book. These were the plants as they came to Geneva. They were accessioned from whatever their accessioning number was. And those are born in Boissier's Flora Orientalis. So I had to look at both the numbers to make sure the plant that was correctly named or identified at that time. He also maintained a journal, which is quite amusing. Of course, the original journal, unfortunately, is lost. But, you know, sometimes in the piles and piles of plants that are found in herbaria, sometimes you do find them, and I'm really hoping that in the Museum of Natural History in France, in Paris, one day somebody will say, oh, we found a journal which belonged to Aucher. But the original is no longer there, but it was obviously at that time translated into French and published by Jobert, who was at that time the director of the Natural History Museum in 1843. And I've used this journal to basically put together his journey as he took it in Oman. So at the end he wrote, to sum up, I have not collected more than 250 species over the whole of the Imamate of Muscat. And he said the local people say that very shortly after rains, which occur once or twice a year, the land is covered with flowers. But who would resign themselves to spending a year in a country where you have to suffer such extreme heat, breathe such air that is almost mortal for Europeans? In any case, I'm convinced that in this country, the most barren in the world, it would be difficult to find more than 500 species. Now, he wasn't really way out. So over the period of time, since I was in Oman to when I have been in Kew, I have actually written the Flora of Oman, a detailed descriptive flora of that region, but also including the southern and the central part of Oman. In the northern part, the number of species for the whole of Oman is about 1,240, now plus minus 10, because there are some species still which are not described. The flowering plants consist of almost 98.2%. Most of them are angiosperms. Northern Oman does have something like about 700 species. So he wasn't too far out, I mean, considering he was only there for 1 month. But obviously his experience told him, you know, kind of how many species would there be. Compared to the other parts of the Arabian Peninsula, Oman is the third rich in species. So the richest is Yemen, of course, with the mountains and the varied climate and geomorphological features. Saudi Arabia is also quite high. Actually, Saudi Arabia is less than this. This is incorrect. with the escarpment mountains. All the others are below 1,000. They are not very rich, as one can expect. They are mostly fairly deserted countries and with a very low diversity. So just to show you some of the plants as they were collected by Aucher. This is one of the specimens which is from the Natural History Museum here at the BA. This is Polygamous muscatensis. Some of the plants were distributed out to these experts. So they came to Kew, they came to the Natural History Museum, and they also went to Berlin. And this is one of the plants. This is how plants are maintained and kept. They are pressed and then mounted. This is the original labels as present in Geneva. A couple others. Of course, they look, I mean, this is a Resiga Aucher-Éloy and notes written by various people. As it is the custom for something new, you write and describe them there, or try to describe as much as possible when the plants are fairly fresh. And some of the plants which are still new to science, as we saw, Lonicera, Geranium muscatense, Moringa, which we have seen. So his arrival to the environment of Muscat, 6th of March, and he writes in his journal, I woke that morning near the coast, not far from Sohar, to the sound of tambourines. It was a festival of Ramadan, and of course it was Eid at that time, and I have actually checked. It was Eid or during or sort of Eid time, and it was a festivity in 1838. And he noted that the Arabs, of course, have a tremendous passion for music and dancing, and he says it's this ululating sound that you probably all know from the North Africa and also from the Arabian Peninsula for expressing joy or a welcome sound. But he also knows that the coast is covered by uninterrupted forests of palm trees. Now, this is no longer there because there's so much development. If you have been to Oman recently, on the coastal areas, there's so much development that you don't actually see this forest of palm trees. It is also that a lot of the aquifers have become saline, so the salinity has increased over the coastal areas, killing most of the palm groves or date palms. As his boat approached into Muscat, he writes about the Portuguese built fort, which is still there and has been restored. Very, very attractive point in Muscat. And notes that the streets of Muscat are very narrow and very dirty. Well, they're not dirty right now, but they were probably so many years ago. Also, he notes that there are banyas. These are mostly Indians, Negroes, and Persian merchants. And but noting that the major part is Arab, though the dominant color seems to be black. He writes of Muscat, the port's entry not being directed towards the town. The place is very hot and sort of disagreeable. And he says, according to the English, a single night spent on land would most certainly cause death. However, he writes that he's discovered some foreigners who have lived here for a time and they're perfectly fit. If you can imagine. The next 2 days, he basically getting ready, and of course he was carrying a lot of letters for the Amirs to get permissions to enter the interior. He just writes about what he has seen around, and he says that there are lots of donkeys, and they are exported to Persia, which is really quite, I hadn't thought of that at all. And fruits like bananas and mangoes, and just noticing also that there are plenty of prostitutes in Muscat, which is quite quite strange, but I mean, being a poet, I guess it wasn't. He writes of the Sheikh's soldiers, and he says these are all naked men with long hair falling tousled about their heads, and they look like absolute savages, and they have such ferocious faces. He was quite recounting some of the difficulties that he still has, because he had to gain permissions from the British and as well from the French to be able to enter the interior. And he says there are further difficulties, together with all the permissions that he had to get, that the only pack animals are donkeys. And says whatever their strength, they cannot carry large burdens. And he had a lot of plants, the paper that he has to press all the plants in, and they all have to be carried on the donkeys. And he just saying, Lord, have pity on me. It was quite amusing there. So, I mean, finally, by the 13th of March, he is ready to lead, and then getting the guides and all the donkeys together, he is more or less ready to lead. And this came as not as a surprise, but I was quite surprised. Well, yes, I should say, when he said he was obliged to remain the whole day in Muscat and watch the actual sale of slaves. That it was as recent as 1838 that still this practice was there in Oman. And the sale is by auction. The Qadi sits some distance away, and the sale of each slave is concluded. He makes out a property deed in favor of the buyer on receipt of a payment. So this was very much there, and these slaves came from everywhere. And there were women and men and young from Africa, as well as from other parts of the Arabian Peninsula. So now he's ready to travel in. He left Muscat once more, meaning he had to come back and then go back again. The soldiers, he had got some of the soldiers, and he said that they were a very, very simple uniform, a loincloth, and that was it. Took 3 camels and came from Matra, and the same day reached Nahal. It is quite a long journey to Nahal, and passing through Qurram, Bataya, Rubi, Hubra, he settled and for the night between the villages of Qais and Bey Khalil. I have not been able to actually locate these villages, so the names must have changed. I looked through several old books and gazetteers and things. I do not know why I haven't, but these names do not exist anymore. Al-Khod is very much there, and it is an oasis. It has got water over there, and cultivation is done quite well over there. And he basically records the same thing, although this photo is much more recent. But Al-Khod is quite cultivated. Later on, 16th, 17th March, he arrived at the banks of a river which come from the village of Khod and enters near the village of Sea. Again, now this river is now it's no longer kind of a river. It's a very, hardly, it doesn't actually reach the village of Sea. There is a spring in Al-Khod and there is a bit of water, much more during the time of rains, but not really flowing as such. And of course, he also notes that at this time there was a scare of locusts, and yes, there was, as from time to time, the locusts do form plagues, you may call it. Traveling on for 4 hours and reached the fort of Nahal. This fort still exists by the village of Nahal, and when I was there, it was like this. So this photograph was taken sometimes in the early 90s or late 1980s. It has been restored and it has been made into like quite a nice area for visitors. So if you go now, it is no longer like this. It's much more developed, let's put it this way. Now, he also noticed that there are very good crops, plenty of palm trees and bananas and mangoes, of course. and sugarcane, from which sugar is not made, but merely the juice is sucked. Now, sugarcane, or the cultivation of sugarcane, is no longer there in Oman at all. I mean, people may grow a few sugarcane in their private gardens, but it is no longer really considered as a commercial crop or grown in date groves. Palm, yes, it's grown a lot, but not sugarcane at all. So he settled outside the fort, and then went variously every day to the mountains to collect some plants. And of course, a fine tree in Nuberia, attractive flowering bush of Bogelia, and talks about one of the plants which is now called Darophytum indigo, and he called it Bogelia leprosa. Of course, the names have taxonomists love to change names from time to time, so that name is now being changed. Glaucoma Aucher-Éloy, that was a new plant, which first one, Niberia, called after Niebuhr, the botanist, which is again now changed its name to Glaucoma. So he was visiting all these mountains or areas, going by day, coming back indeed, and the Sheikh of Nahal, he said, has sent me food twice a day. Lunch was composed of very white bread, as thin as lace, which I think everybody knows or who has eaten around the Arabian Peninsula. The bread is made, and it's almost like lace, with a very, very thin dough, which is spread over quite a large heated pan, and is almost crunchy. And the rest of the lunch is a glass of slightly soured milk. In the evening, there is palau made with butter and some beans boiled in their rough husks, so that I must extract the beans as I go. This is the usual Arab diet where meat would do one harm. Well, it hasn't really harmed the Arabs, because now if you eat in any of the Arab restaurants, whether they are very sophisticated or not, meat is very much an integral part of the diet, chicken and lamb and goat. Now, he also made several excursions. He knew from Egypt some of the plants. Moringa peregrina is one of them. And as he wrote it, you can almost see that this plant grows in the most inaccessible rocks. It's very difficult to collect these plants because it grows from the crevices. It somehow collects enough organic material, some sand, and starts to germinate and starts to grow from there. Very difficult to collect. Aucher hasn't mentioned the extraction of oil from Moringa, but this is something that has been done for a fairly long period of time in Oman, and it is done mostly by women. The seeds of Moringa, which are in very long pods, are collected. They are crushed just by a mortar and kneaded, just kneaded on as a flour till the oil starts to come out. You can just about see on the stone this yellow bit coming out. And this basically is just taken with the hand and collected in bottles. This is known as the halal shu, which is the oil of shua or oil of moringa. It's been given the name as wonder oil because it is used for, well, a lot of medical ailments, topically, for headaches, burns, lacerations, bone fractures, muscle, back pain, cosmetically to soften skin, and it's taken internally, mixed with other like cardamom and clove oil during childbirth. So it's got a lot of value even today. It's fairly expensive because it is quite difficult to take. There is no commercial industry to take the oil. It is done by a few villages up in the Hajar Mountains, in the northern mountains, and it's sold during the time when the seeding comes. So going on from off the Hajar Mountains, he goes up to the top of the mountains collecting plants, and he writes of the Arabs. He says, "On my return I found an Arab waiting for me, judging that after such an arduous excursion I would be thirsty. He had brought me some sour milk and dates, simply from kindness and hospitality, and without the least thought of profiting from his gesture. I think he didn't have that very many good experiences in Persia, because he wrote, "What a difference between these people and the Persians." Woe to a poor foreigner finding himself in Persia without money. He would die of hunger without the least doubt. So, well, there you are. So, a few more plants that he collected on several on his occasions in the Hajar Mountains, and basically Aloe, vera, or which is quite common. This is in the wadis over there. I've looked at a lot of populations of aloe, and I'm not absolutely certain that it is wild in Oman. It is always found next to a village or a habitation, and almost near graveyards. Well, this is a grave. It was an old graveyard over there. And it's quite possible that it has been brought in by people because of its medicinal value. It is normally used, the gel, for skin burns. So everywhere it was extremely common to wean children. Women would smear it on their breast because it's quite bitter in taste. So it would wean the kids of drinking breast milk. But more than anything, it was used as tropically to cool the skin or to cool the headache if you were burning with a fever. But now it's fairly common, and as probably you know, aloe vera, it generates vegetatively. You don't need always the seeds, so it's quite common in the areas where it is. Some of the other plants, quite pretty plants, Lindenbergia, cistus, a Mediterranean plant which comes into the Arabian Peninsula, always found near water, oleander. It used to be called Oleander muscatense because Aucher thought that it was probably new, but later on it's the same. It's oleander, the same as that found in the Mediterranean. This is a very pretty plant, Moringa, and when it flowers, it does have bright red dots on the gravel. So Moringa elegans, it's called, because, well, it is perhaps quite an elegant looking plant. So between the 24th and 27th of March, he climbed up, which is quite a steep climb, to the village of Bakkar. So he would have climbed from the Hubra, which is quite it's called the Hubra Bowl, so it's quite a flat area, climbed up. Well, this is which we normally would have taken if he had a car. Perhaps it was the same. And as you climb up, you're at about 1,800 to 2,000 meters, and suddenly palm trees become less, and other types of plants can be easily grown. So this is mostly more temperate, and even now, it's a very pretty village where a lot of agriculture is done, and plums are grown at this. Also talks about violet, a very pretty viola, and Darnesia. These are plants which normally grow above 1,800 meters. So he was able to collect these plants, and in fact, I found them as well. Climbing up from there onto the Said Plateau, they went onto the central massif of the Hajar Mountains, which is called Jabal Akhtar, the mountain which is a green mountain, by way of stair down a path and going to the village. Now, on the Jabal Akhtar, you start to get juniper, so the complete change of climate is coupled with the type of plants that you get over there. You get olive, which is coupled with juniper. So these are some of the juniper trees over here. This is olive. Quite different from the type of plants that you get lower down. We continued to climb Mount Akhtar, passed along the crest to the mountain to Sek, and then to Wadi Bani Habib, where, of course, at that 2,200 or 2,500 meters, you can grow nut, you can grow fig, apricot, wine, pomegranate. This is the village of Bini Bini Habib, and I photographed it when I went last year in September. It is pretty much in ruins now and open to visitors, open to tourists, but it hasn't been restored, and I wish they would do that before it completely falls to destruction and degradation. On Jabal Akhtar as well are the beautiful terraces that you can see only over here. There are nowhere else on the mountains in Oman. And on these mountains there is a fair amount of cultivation. At present, the cultivation is mostly of pomegranate, plums, and making rose water. This is something which is very unique to the area, and the plantations which are those of rose, these are quite old plantations. They are called Ward al-Shirazi, apparently brought in by the Persians about 400 or 500 years ago, and they were planted out at the top because the climate over there was equable for their growth. The rose water that is made in a very traditional manner. This happens even now. They put the roses in these small clay pots, put fire or coal inside a clay oven, and as the water heats up, it is then condensed into another container. Now, the rose water which comes out doesn't smell of roses at all. It just smells of smoke. But they seem to like it, very much so, and they use it for flavoring halwa, which is the Omani sweet made out of flour, very sweet. And they also will put it on their turbans and so on. But it does not smell of rose water. So now coming down, they started to come down from Tanoof, and there are steps which come down again, which have been made a good 400 or 500 years ago, again now called the Persian steps. And he said he's noted a large tree, which I believe to be new. Well, this is not new, but this is one of the trees that I haven't been able to locate. There are other plants which are not at this place. This is Ticomella undulata, quite a pretty looking plant. And then he said that at the village of Tanoof, he met the sheikh, went into the fortress, and he said, my presence caused great astonishment in the land and to the sheikh himself. After shaking hands and repeated 5 or 6 times, he sat near the sheikh and started to make an inventory of him. So his shoes were examined, and then my watch, which hung around my neck. He asked what it was, having no idea. Having heard the sound of the movement, he approached it to his ear and could not restrain a cry of admiration. The watch passed from hand to hand, or rather from ear to ear. It was another thing when I opened it and showed him the movement. I had not expected such simplicity so near Muscat, which is frequented by Europeans. So he just sort of notes how simple the people were, and in a way untouched by how would I say, modernization of that time. So then Aucher traveled to Niswa, and again he writes in his journal that there were lots of sugarcane, and from which a black syrup was made, and banana, cotton, mango, grenadine, lemon. Now these things are no longer cultivated. Over a period of time, Oman depends so much on exports. I mean, it gets everything from out. Everything is from there, but hardly anything apart from dates is cultivated. And lemons are cultivated over there. Unfortunately, at this stage he became ill, could not travel, and had to rest for various reasons. Of course, there were some, he had to wait for some guides before he could travel on because of fear of robbers. And then coming into April, he traveled a little bit, but then he says the fever came back again. He was tired, obviously exposed, and the Sheikh was truly most honorable towards me, making me regularly 3 visits a day, and bought some lumps of sugar, which was a rare thing in this country, even though it was covered with sugarcane, says. And while he was there, he just made a note of what he had seen: camels, donkeys, dogs, cats, chickens, goats. He said he'd never seen any mules, sheep, buffalo, turkeys, geese, ducks, domestic pigeon, or bees. But and of the cultivated vegetables were onions and radishes and peas. And he did notice spinning and weaving, which was the only industry. Now it's still there, and you can find some weavers and spinners, but it is only done now mostly for tourists. It's no longer really used. It used to be not too long ago, because they used to make sort of blankets, but those were and used in their homes, but it's now becoming even rarer. So, well, he just writes about his journeys more, and camping in the center of the village, or the Arabs from the surrounding coming to visit him. And again, he had to wait because the Sheikh told him that it was infested with robbers. Then the Sheikh came back with a whole band of donkeys to carry some men and baggage, and they left to the beautiful valley, getting back to Matra. I think he was extremely well, but he regrets that he didn't actually take a rest, because that did take its toll on his health. So back to Muscat, he said, I arrived very early at Matra. The shamal was very violent. This is the wind which comes in the spring, and the boatmen were not very happy to take him. And he, of course, gave them money, and it was a complete disaster, as he says. So much water came into the boat that it was as if I was in a bath. At last we arrived, and at once I was overcome with violent fever. So he again became very ill, never really recovered from his journey back to Matra. Aucher-Éloy, he felt very ill and never really truly recovered, and died 6 months later after going back from Muscat, which was in Iran. He went to Isfahan, and from there he wanted to go to Kandahar to collect some more. He couldn't go back to Kandahar, but died in Isfahan, and as we saw, buried in Juniper. Of the Arabs, he wrote, with the people of the interior I met with great hospitality, honesty and friendship. And talks about the republican rule of the sheikhs, which it was due to that. They're not rich, but none visibly poor. They always have dates which take place of bread, and there is a wide variety of fruit in season, and on the coast there's plenty of fish. So he was, in a way, I would say, rather nostalgic and rather embracing the hospitality of the Arabs. Well, that's it. Thank you very much.